Most people will flex with a Rolex, but woodworkers, they flex with a Festool Domino. That's right, this is a $1,200 woodworking machine that is the pinnacle of German engineering. But do you need to spend that much money to do what this machine does? These two jigs will work with your router to do the same thing that the Domino does. This one is the Komax handheld mortiser, and I found this thing on Alibaba for 70 bucks when I was looking on there one night, and I just impulse bought it. It had free shipping, even though it was going to take 30 days, and here it is. But while I was waiting for it, my buddy Dave Picciuto over at Make Something put out a video about this jig, the Tianli, which is about $200, although it's 260 Canadian, which I think that's like 10 bottles of maple syrup. I did buy all these with my own money, including the Domino, and that $1,200 was a little hard to swallow, but kind of using this as an excuse to see what all the Festool hype is about. That does taste good. Now let me show you how each of these showed up, because right from the get-go, you can see some clear differences. But the Festool comes in one of those nice hard plastic sustainers, and that's how you can store it. And you've probably seen these, the guys that stack them, a mile high to give that big Festool flex. And it's got space for everything, and it comes with a bunch of attachments for the $1,200. Now these two are jigs, so you'll have to have a router with them, so as they ship, they just come with the jig. Now the Tianli, as it showed up, it came in a box, which I opened up and found 2 router bits in, which was nice, and another little box. And as I opened that up, there was just the jig sitting there. Absolutely nothing else. No padding, no packaging, no instructions, nothing. They didn't even include the Allen wrenches, which you would need to lock down the router and adjust the collar stop. So a little bit bare bones. Now, as for the Komax, it did take 30 days to ship from China, and when it showed up, it looked like maybe something that Pablo Escobar was sending over from Colombia. Nice little smuggler's wrap there. But I cut into it, and it was covered in some foam, and as I pulled it out, I have the nice little jig here, as well as a set of instructions. Unfortunately, they were entirely in Chinese, and I can't read Chinese. But one thing it did come with was an Allen wrench, so I appreciate the thought. So these are just jigs, and they will need a router like I mentioned, but you can't use something like a Rigid or a Bosch or a Milwaukee because they have these little adjustment pieces on it, and basically the body of the router is not cylindrical and smooth, so it definitely will not work on the Komax and more than likely not on the Tianli, also because of the size. So all the adjustments with the Festool are extremely fast, and everything is nicely labeled, and it's all toolless. So you can just turn some levers and move the fence, set the height adjustment for this top plate, as well as the depth adjustment of your cut, and you can all get it done very quickly. So the Festool for sure is going to get 5 stars on setup. All right, next is the Tianli, and this thing is made very well. This is all milled aluminum, and it's anodized. Looks really nice. It's got a nice weight to it. One of my big gripes with this jig, though, is that it did not come with any instructions whatsoever, so I just kind of had to figure it out. I mean, it's fairly intuitive, but it really would have been a lot easier if we did have some instructions. But the router just slides in, and then you can lock it down if you bring your own Allen key. I'm still salty about that. Now, another thing I didn't like is the little stop collar actually sticks down past the bottom plate. So the whole jig actually rocks on the table when it's sitting down and doesn't sit flat. And that's just not what I would expect for a $200 jig. Now, probably the thing I like the most is the cool little adjustment for how much it swings side to side. You can turn these little knobs, and there's 2 little orange plates underneath that move open to show you the distance that it will go back and forth. So all in all, I would give this setup probably a 3 because it could be easier, but everything is really nice and solid. All right, now switching over to the Komax, this thing was an adventure right from the beginning. I really like the design and how it's got the trigger handle up top, but you have to plug your router into it. And what I noticed right away is that the plugs were not polarized, whereas the male side of the plug on my router is polarized, so it would not fit into the female plug on the jig. So before I could start anything, I went out and bought a new female plug, and I'm no electrician, so I was a little weary as I hooked it up. I've got it back together and it's plugged in. If I did it right, then the little one should be the hot side. And if I didn't do it right, then it's been nice knowing you. Just kidding. Sorry, Mom. Yeah, we're good. Now the router for this one sits in this little plastic collar here, and it is definitely not as high quality as the Tianli, and this plastic, I just feel like this might break at any moment, but it's got a nice little lockdown knob that you can turn to secure it. And then I could get this front fence set up, which went pretty quickly. I also really like that it does lock down on both sides with an Allen key. Now the front to back adjustment is just controlled by a little screw in the front. And honestly, there's not a lot of play there, but even worse is the side to side adjustment is also held by screws. But the problem is that it's already in the most locked down position. So all I can do is make that wider. And in the stock position, it cuts a really wide groove, which you'll see here in just a second. Because I had to rewire the thing to even use it and just the lack of adjustability, I'll definitely give this one 2 stars on the setup. All right, now we're gonna look at how these actually perform cutting some joints, and we're gonna start with the most common, which would be just an edge-to-edge joint like we do for maybe a tabletop. So for this test, I was laying out 3 dominoes on each of the samples and then being able to cut them and join them together nicely. I started off with the domino, and one of the nice things about this is you actually don't have to mark the edge joints because it has these little tabs here that are referencing, so you can just hook this around the edge and then make your cut on each end, and then it's gonna line up perfect with the next one. So all I had to do was mark the middle joint and then just line that up on the center and made my plunge cuts, and of course everything worked out fine and fit like a charm. Now neither of these jigs have any kind of locating pins or anything, so I had to mark each of the 3 lines on the boards. Then I moved over to the Tianli, and so it does have a nice little indicator of where to line up the cut on the line that you made. And then as I put it in position and held on to the knob, it felt pretty sturdy. And then I just turned on the router and started making the cut, moving it back and forth and plunging it. Now it is a little tricky because you have to kind of adjust how much of a cut you're taking at a time, but that's something I'm sure you would get used to really quickly. And the Tianli performed really well. I put the dominoes in and the boards fit together exactly like the Festool did. Now the Komax was a pretty similar experience. It also has that little indicator that you can line up. Now I do like the grip on the Komax. This grip, you can just like throw a G.I. Joe Kung Fu grip on that thing, and it just feels really nice in your hand. Along with the trigger, it feels almost kind of like a domino. So the Komax slots are oversized because of that stop adjustment I talked about, and if you did the full width, it's going to be that wide, which is really wide. So what I started to do is just kind of eyeball it within the window. So using the Komax without some adjustments, the slots are not going to be tight, but the top panels are nice and flush, just like the other tools. So I was pleasantly surprised with these things. Like when you line them up, the holes that these cut are exactly the same ones that the Domino cut with the 5mm bit. They looked great and they all fit together perfectly. I am going to give the edge to the Festool because of that positive locking, so we're going to give the Festool 5 stars, but these guys are going to both come in at a solid 4 stars for that edge-to-edge joint. So the quality of the cuts were great, but what about the speed? Because that's something the Festool is really nice, is that it's pretty fast. So as I started looking at these, it took me about 30 seconds to cut all 3 of those joints with the Festool. And the nice thing is, all you have to do is that one forward and back motion, plus the referencing, makes it pretty quick. Now for these other 2, you do have to line them up, and then you have to do the back and forth motion as well as the plunging, and you don't want to get crazy on that. If you start whipping it side to side to go faster, you can move that off the mark, and that happened to me a couple times. So you got to be a little gentle and exercise some caution. So both of these took just under a minute to make those same 3 cuts. So for speed, I'll give the Domino 5 stars, and these guys, I will put them in at 3 stars. So for all these cuts, I am using a 5x30 Domino, which is 5mm thick. Now the standard cutter on the Domino is 5mm, so I also got a 5mm router bit. Now when I use the Domino in that 5mm hole, it is a little loose on some, but at the same time, if I turn the same Domino around, it's actually pretty tight. But 3/16 would be a really tight fit if you went down to that. Now the router bits the Tianli came with was 5/16, and if I try to use an 8mm Domino, it is really loose fit, so you'd probably want to get an 8mm. I actually did buy an 8mm bit, but I didn't realize it wouldn't fit in my 1/4 inch router, so that didn't work out. The next joint I wanted to try out was for face frames, because I know a lot of people will use Dominoes for that or just smaller material. So these are 2-inch pieces, and if I wanted to join them into a T like that, how would we do it? All right, so the Domino has this cool little small parts jig that attaches to it, and it adjusts to hold anything from about 3/4 to about 2 3/4 of an inch. So the Domino easily cuts on the end of small parts, so you can put those together like you would for a face frame. Now, unfortunately, these other jigs can't do that because of that wide opening, and it doesn't have support along the center, and so that board would just go straight through and into the cutter with no support at all. So the smallest parts that you can make in cuts on would be about 4 inches wide. So for doing face frame cuts, I'm going to give the Domino a 5 again, and the Tianli and the Komax, they get a 1 because they just can't get it done. Now, speaking of that wide opening, I think it's only fair that we talk a little bit about safety. Because these two jigs, I don't know. I could kind of see you ending up on the OSHA Is This Okay Instagram page. Now with the Festool, everything is enclosed. You cannot see the bit when it is not plunged out. And then when you do plunge it, the bit does come out just a bit, but it has a very strong spring, so it goes right back. Even if I stand the tool on edge, the own body weight doesn't compress the spring. So you've really got to be pushing on it to get that cutter to come out. Now on the Tianli, this is actually the worst. Just look, there is just no covering. The entire bit is exposed here. And since you have to turn it on and off on the side, you're moving your hands around. That just is an opportunity for something bad to happen. Also, it's really kind of floppy when you're holding it, so the spring doesn't even hold up the weight of the fence, so that's going to come down. And I did this when I was actually setting it up, and luckily I didn't hurt myself, but it was a bit scary. Whoa, dadgummit. Now the Komax does have the bit exposed as well, but it's got this little crossbar that the Tianli doesn't have, and so it does kind of protect that from if anything were to fall down right on top of it. The spring on this one's kind of halfway in between. It will hold it up, but it does dip down about halfway into the plunge. But the one thing that the Komax really has going for it is this trigger, because if something goes wrong and I let go of that trigger, it immediately turns off. So I really like that feature from a safety perspective. So for safety, we're going to give the Festool a 5. I'm going to give the Komax a 3.5, and I'm going to give the Tianli a 2. Now another popular use for domino joinery is making cabinetry. So you could have an end butt joint like you're attaching sides to a top or bottom, or maybe even attaching a piece in the middle for a center divider. So let's see how these do. Now this type of joint is a new challenge because not only do we need slots on the edge, but we also need them along the face. I started off with the domino and I used the tips from Festool to cut them. He has a great channel. If you want to know anything about Festool, go check him out. So he says to use this vertical support. So I went ahead and attached that and made the cuts vertically. And it was a little tricky keeping it from tipping, and I'm sure again you get better with time. But despite my domino newbiness, I was able to get some good joints on it and it went together great. And that front joint was nice and smooth between the edge and the face. Now for the Tianli for this cut, I just followed the directions. Right, there are no directions. But I did look at some videos and it showed them cutting it vertically. So I went ahead and clamped the piece in place vertically using a little MacGyverism and some clamps. And actually I was pleasantly surprised with the Tianli. Because of this nice big front face plate, it was able to really register on that board, and then it was really rock solid. And I was able to cut those little slots in there really easily. And when I put the dominoes in there, it came together perfect, just like the Festool, and it was nice and smooth on the joint. As I grabbed my old dollar store domino, I started to make that cut for the face frame, and then I realized that is not gonna work. This has a major issue because it is exactly the opposite of the Tianli. There is no big front face here. There's no flat face to register at all. This little part here that sticks out for the adjustment doesn't allow you to get flush, and so you literally just can't make that cut on a face frame. So we cannot do these at all. Now you could probably make a little jig on the front to fix that, but as it comes out of the box, not gonna work. So in a little bit of a surprise on this one, I'm gonna give the domino a 4 for some of that tippiness. The Tianli is gonna get a 5, and the old Komax gets a 1. Now, as I've probably made it clear, I really think this Tianli should come with some instructions for a $200 tool, but it and the Komax should probably come with something else. A respirator. Because the dust collection, there is none. There is absolutely no dust collection. Dust just shoots everywhere because you just don't have a place to put a hose, and it is just flying in my face, and I started wearing the respirator when making the cuts. And at the end, there's dust all over my table, and you guys know I hate dust. Now, on the flip side, the domino is an absolute dream for dust collection. Zero dust. So for the dust collection category, both of these are gonna get a big fat 1, and the domino is gonna get a 5. Now these being routers, they are loud also, so you want to protect your ears as well. I love my IsoTunes Extra 2.0s, and I wear these around the shop all the time. They're Bluetooth, and I listen to podcasts and music. But if you're not an earbud person, they also have earmuffs like these Air Defenders. You can check them out. They are a channel sponsor, and you can get 10% off your entire order. Just use code FTBT. There's a link down below in the description. Now, putting a board in the center is probably not used quite as much, but it is nice to know if you can do it or not. So this one is going to require some holes right down the middle of our board. Now again, I started with my domino and I used a technique from Sedge. I just traced the outline of that board and then I folded it over and clamped it down in place. Then I could use the domino to make both cuts in that one position. And honestly, this was probably the easiest one there is because I could just clamp them in place and then cut both of them at the same time. Now the reason I could do that is because the bottom of the domino to the center of the cutter is 10 millimeters. So by using this as registration for both of those cuts, it lined up perfectly. And when I put those dominoes in and stood it up, it was right inside the joint and it worked awesome. Now on the Tianli, of course, we have this front fence, so making that face cut would be an issue. So I went ahead and took it off and tried to turn it around to see if that would work. But unfortunately, when it's turned around, it just runs into the router. Now I guess you could just take it all the way off and then register this back fence against an offset piece, but you definitely have to do some math and figure it out. And honestly, I just don't like using this thing vertical because the weight of it just pulls it down and I think it'd be really hard to control. Now, of course, we know the Komax can't do it because it just can't sit flush and make that face cut. So I'm definitely going to give the Domino a 5 on this one. I'm going to give the Tianli a 2 because I think you could pull it off and register off that back fence and use an offset, but I wouldn't recommend it. And of course, the Komax is a 1. Now, after spending some time with these, I'm kind of surprised and also kind of not. The Domino by far was the best. It came in at 4.9 stars. If you want to see all of the ratings, they're up on the screen right now. You can pause and come back to them. But if you can at all afford it, I would highly recommend the Domino. I have really enjoyed it. It is a great tool. Now for the Tianli, it came in at a 2.6 and it does do some things very well. And I would say that if you do have a Makita router or DeWalt that would fit in it, go ahead and buy it, and I think it'll get some good value out of it. But if you've got to buy a new router, you're up to like $400, and I don't think it's worth it at that point. Just save up and get a used Domino. Now for the little Komax, it doesn't do much, but it does one thing pretty well. And I don't know, I just really love the way it looks, I like the way it feels, and I think it's kind of fun. You could even grab some green paint and maybe turn it into a Domino. Now, if you want to see some really cheap tools, I got tools under $20 right there. I think you're going to love that video. Big thank you to the FTBT Builders Club. And until next time, guys, get out there and build something awesome.